I understand the traffic's a little tight out there, but we're going to go ahead and start anyway. Welcome you to the Baker Institute. I know a good many of you, or at least recognize you as familiar denizens here, but for those I don't, my name is Bill Martin. I'm the Senior Fellow for Religion and Public Policy here at the Institute. I've been looking forward to this day for a long time, and to a large degree, it's due to my pleasure in finally getting to meet Douglas Johnston in person. I'm not going to repeat the information you have in your program, since I presume you all read it at least grade level or better. I don't want to boast, but I'm 71, but I can actually read at the 80-year-old level. But I do want to say that Dr. Johnston has had a presence and an influence in the Baker Institute from its earliest days, which he may not recognize. In 1996, I wrote an article called Religion and Statecraft for the volume that celebrated the first conference at the Baker Institute, Foreign Policy Challenges at the End of the Century. And although the paper was based on research I had done, I adapted the title from Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft, which grew out of a project Dr. Johnston had led and to which he contributed importantly. And that book had inspired my thinking on the subject, and I quoted from it then. And more recently, in his new book, Ambassador Jurigian, his book, Danger and Opportunity, he quoted Dr. Johnston's work in citing examples of the ways people of differing faiths can call on the resources of their respective religions to help achieve peace and understanding rather than conflict and enmity. The book, now in its 15th printing, and will be available for you outside if you'd like to have a copy, is required reading for the U.S. Foreign Service Institute. And in 1999, Sapio, Japan's equivalent of Time magazine, called it one of the 10 most important books to read in preparing for the 21st century. In reading his work over the years and learning about the International Center for Religion and Democracy, which Dr. Johnston founded in 1999, I've been impressed with the center's and his efforts to include religion in attempts to mediate identity-based conflicts that reach or that exceed the reach of traditional diplomacy in such places as Syria, Afghanistan, Iran, Sudan, Kashmir, and elsewhere. Its activities include sending interreligious mediation teams to conflict areas and training both religious leaders and the general public about the process of peacemaking. From its beginning, the Baker Institute has recognized the role that religion plays in human lives. Often, we have focused on religiously based conflict. This year, in a series of programs, we are emphasizing the positive contributions religion can make in reconciling divided people to each other and to the higher demands of their own religion. I'm happy tonight to see a number of my friends from the Institute for Interfaith Dialogue, Turkish Muslims who share many of the same aims, and have been working here in Houston and Austin and elsewhere in this country to foster and encourage the kind of creative dialogue that can lead to peace among divided peoples. In fact, I got this tie on a recent trip to Turkey to visit some of the work that they are doing there. And it was given to me along with some other gifts. It's really a very nice and expensive tie, and I gave them a refrigerator magnet with Texas symbols on it. I think they thought it was a pretty even trade. In any case, I'm happy to welcome my friends here, particularly. Douglas Johnston has spent much of his life in the work of bringing peace on earth. Dr. Johnston, blessed are the peacemakers. That's not original with me, but I concur with the sentiment. We're eager to have you tell us about your work, and we welcome you to Baker Institute.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you all for coming out this evening. It's a great privilege to be here speaking to the Baker Institute. I'm humbled by the caliber of those who've gone before, so I'll work through that humility as we go along. I'm going to talk to you about faith-based diplomacy, but before I do, I'd like to just sort of set a strategic context for you. For more than a dozen years now, defense planners at the Pentagon have been wrestling with the challenges of what's called the asymmetric threat. For any of you who may not be familiar with that, it's a term of art that sort of conveys attack by creative, unconventional means by a disadvantaged opponent against a more powerful adversary, much like bin Laden used on 9/11 to rock our country back on its heels. And in response to this, the Pentagon has come up with a new concept called irregular warfare, which calls for a much tighter coordination between defense, diplomacy, and development, all to the good. But I maintain that even before this economic crisis, we don't have enough money in the U.S. Treasury to protect this country against the full spectrum of asymmetric threats. And what's really needed, in my estimation, is an asymmetric counter, one that displaces the ideas behind the guns. Now, that may sound pretty straightforward and easy, but it's made more complicated by the fact that there's a religious dimension to these ideas. And as I think we're all well aware from watching what's taken place in Iraq and Afghanistan, our country really has very little ability to deal with religious differences in a hostile setting. Nor do we have any ability to counter demagogues like bin Laden who manipulate religion for their own purposes. And it seems supremely ironic that one of the most religious nations on the face of the planet is so unable to deal with these religious imperatives that permeate today's geopolitical landscape. Among the reasons, I think three stand out. First is our long-held commitment to the rational actor model of decision-making, in which religion was deemed to be irrational and therefore outside of the policymaker's calculus. In short, we simply don't know how to deal with it. Second, we've regrettably used our separation of church and state as a crutch for not doing our homework to understand how religion informs the worldviews and political aspirations of others who do not similarly separate the two. And finally, also stemming from that separation, are some real operational constraints. You know, in the United States, we've so relegated religion to the realm of the personal that when you mention the word, industry or government, they head for the hills for fear of being accused of favoring one faith tradition over another. And then we transplant that same mentality on an extraterritorial basis overseas, and we find that neither our diplomats nor our military personnel are able to deal with the religious dimension of these threats. So we're out there with one hand tied behind our back. Well, when you add to all of this looming specter of the possible marriage of religious extremism with weapons of mass destruction, it just adds to the urgency for the need to bridge this gap. Well, one form of engagement that shows unusual promise is this business of faith-based diplomacy. Now, what that means at the macro level is simply incorporating religious considerations into the practice of international politics. Operationally, it means making religion part of the solution in these intractable identity-based conflicts that, as Bill said, exceed the grasp of traditional diplomacy. So if you want to read about that in greater depth, we came out with the first book that Bill mentioned, Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft, came out in 1994, published by Oxford University Press. Well, a sequel to that is a book called Faith-Based Diplomacy, Trumping Realpolitik. And this came out in 2003, also by Oxford University Press. And it goes into quite some depth. Well, since our inception, our center, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, has been practicing this form of diplomacy in a number of different areas of the world. Bill named some of them. We started in Sudan, then Kashmir, Pakistan, Iran, the Middle East, Afghanistan, and the United States. Now, what I would like to do is just share with you a bit about what we've been doing in Pakistan as an illustration of one way of coming at this faith-based diplomacy. Well, for the last 5 years, we have been on the ground in Pakistan reforming the madrasas, including those that gave birth to the Taliban. Now, these religious schools once enjoyed a very illustrious history. From the Middle Ages through the 16th century, they were unrivaled as institutions of higher learning. Indeed, it was only Western exposure to them that led to the creation of our university system, which many of you are a part of today. Even small things like funding a chair in a given discipline, or the mortar boards and tassels you wear on your hat at graduation, those came out of madrasas. Unfortunately, though, particularly under the impact of colonialism, the madrasas reacted to that by trying to purge themselves of all disciplines that they could identify as being Western in any way, shape, or form, to the point where the majority of them today in Pakistan are about rote memorization of the Quran and the study of Islamic principles. Our goals there have been twofold. One is to expand the curriculums to include the physical and social sciences, but with a particularly heavy emphasis on human rights, particularly women's rights, and religious tolerance. Secondly, probably more importantly, is to transform the pedagogy to create critical thinking skills among the students. Because what you have is you'll run into youngsters as young as the age of 12 who have memorized the Quran from cover to cover, but they really don't know what it means. They don't understand it because they've had to memorize it in Arabic. Their first language is Urdu. They're not given near enough Arabic to understand something as sophisticated as the Quran. So along comes the local militant and misappropriates a little scripture, as all religions are sometimes guilty of doing. And these kids are absolutely easy prey. They've got no ability to challenge, no ability to question. They just they follow the lead of the militant. So why we've been enjoying a degree of success in our efforts thus far, which stand in marked contrast to the past failed attempts by the government of Pakistan. Why we are succeeding, there are three reasons. First is because we are conducting this effort in such a way that the madrasa leaders feel like it's their reform effort, not something imposed from the outside, which means they have a lot of ownership in the reform process. And many of them come up with great ideas. Secondly, we inspire them with their own heritage, not only the heritage of the madrasas themselves, but also of Islam in general, and point out how many of the pioneering breakthroughs in the arts and sciences, including religious tolerance, took place under Islam 1,000 years ago. And the more they hear this, the taller they walk, the more they start internalizing it and thinking, hey, maybe we can do better. And finally, and I think this is probably most important of all, is we ground all changes that we're suggesting in Islamic principles. We back it up with Scripture, and so that they, as they undertake this journey, can feel like they're becoming better Muslims in the process. So that's kind of what we've been doing. Now let me see. You know, I didn't think to ask how this thing operates up here, but haha. This just a few pictures of scenes from what we've been doing over there in Pakistan. This repeats in cryptic form what I've been talking about. And here's our status to date. You know, we've involved something like more than 2,000 madrasa leaders from about 1,300 madrasas in this effort. That may sound like a lot, but it's not. It's just the tip of the iceberg. There's somewhere between 20 to 25,000 of these schools. Not even the government of Pakistan knows how many. So we do feel, however, because many of the schools that we've reached are in very radical areas, that we have sufficient momentum now to start trying to take this effort to scale. Now, what taking it to scale means is several things. One is creating a teacher training institute with the universities. We just finished our first pilot effort, a 6-week training program for madrasa faculty at the University of Karachi. We certainly learned a lot in that process, and there will be 2 more 6-week programs there, but we're going to also do this in the University of Peshawar, University of Quetta, Punjab, and I think maybe one other. But the idea is to try to bring a sense of quality control. Right now there are no standards or accountability. If you want to open a madrasa, you open a madrasa. But this will, I think, be a bit of a leavening ingredient that will bring some real quality to the effort. It's also very important too, because one of the things that is sadly the case, the madrasas feel very isolated and looked down upon, particularly by the Pakistani elite. They certainly feel looked down upon by America, but much of society as well, and the mere fact of them coming into the universities for this training program has enormous implications psychologically, and I think will start helping bridge the gap between these schools and much of society. A second ingredient is that we'll be training the female teachers of girls' madrasas. This is something that was really off limits for us, even though women had been asking us for at least 3 years for the same kind of training. But the men would not hear of it. Now even the men are asking us to do the girls' madrasas. So we've had 3 programs already underway in that area. So I think I think the total number is something about 90 women at this point, but that will continue and grow as the efforts on the male side have as well. Another is to convene scholars, world-class scholars, if you will, or top scholars from the 5 sects that sponsor these schools. In order to sort of, again, this is a matter of ownership, but to develop a curriculum, alternative curriculums for the madrasas based on best practices from throughout the Muslim world. So they're not going to just focus on Pakistan, but we're going to try to give them much broader exposure. We've already brought the top Madrasa Oversight Board to the United States for about 10 days. Took them to see Islamic education in America, universities, think tanks, Congress, the State Department. And when they went back, they actually agreed to do something that they had not been willing to do before, which was to register with the government, officially signing up as a madrasa. And what that implies is that they would teach contemporary subjects in addition to their core religious curriculum. They would forego any no instruction having to do with militancy or a jihad dimension, and actually to take their cues from the government in terms of the educational standards that they would be implementing. Now, on the government side, which the government has not been forthcoming yet, I think they're a little concerned about funding an area that has been such a problem to them, but they had always held this out as the carrot. They would supply the resources that would enable them to teach the contemporary subjects, the textbooks, the teachers in the new disciplines, the computers, all that sort of stuff. So that's still a work in progress. Another piece will be to bring master trainers over to the United States for advanced training. Our master trainers are basically folks who have gone through our workshops but who have shown unusual promise and ability, and we give them additional training, and they go out and they train other madrasas, leaders in madrasas that haven't been involved with this effort to date. So they're a very, I would say, unusually gifted set of folks. Another thing is we want to increase our penetration of the radical areas. That's going to take a concerted effort. And the reason we're able to do the sort of things we do over there is because we have indigenous partners. We've got a very prominent Wahhabi over there called Ali Hadith. and also a very prominent Deobandi partner. Now, of the 5 sects that sponsor the schools, the Deobandis and the Wahhabis, or Ahl Hadith, are the 2 hardest line, and the Deobandis are much stronger and more influential than all the 4 other sects combined. If there were 20,000 madrasas in Pakistan, then chances are probably about 16,000 of them would be Deobandi. So it's a very, very important ingredient in this mix. And these 2 folks who are indigenous partners are very connected to the radical groups over there. And they have been able to get us in to meet with and work with some of the people who really need to hear this stuff the most. And we've been very encouraged by the degree to, once you break through that, that veneer of rage, how open they are actually to listening to new ideas. In fact, let me try to illustrate that a little bit for you. This right here is one of our workshop students at graduation. Here is our project director, who's a Pakistani American. Label it down here an American hero. He actually is a hero because this gent, not only did he spend his youth in Karachi, he attended a madrasa himself. When I met him, he was a trainer at AARP of all places, and but he's one of the best trainers I've ever seen, and has incredible wisdom in dealing with the mindsets that one has to deal with. And on top of all that, he's one of the most likable people you'll ever meet on the face of the planet. So that combination has been like a knife cutting through hot butter. The gent in the middle there is our indigenous Deobandi partner, Hafiz Khalil Ahmed. And Hafiz is an honorary title that you get in front of your name if you have memorized the Quran from cover to cover. And I'll stop at that. And I just want to share with you some stories about what we've been doing to sort of give this a little more life. About 2 years ago, I took a couple of board members over with me to visit several madrasas that had been clearly identified with terrorism. Now, by the way, not all madrasas have anything to do with terrorism, maybe about 15%. That's International Crisis Group's estimate, and that may even be high, I'm not sure. But one of the things I'll tell you is that we approach all of this work with a genuine spirit of humility, because we're very mindful that it was we, the United States, who planted the seeds of jihad in these madrasas in order to grow holy warriors to evict the godless Soviets out of Afghanistan. And then when they left, I don't know how many of you have seen Charlie Wilson's War, but it's pretty accurate. They left, we left. And so these folks are still there doing what we trained them to do, only they've shifted targets. So strong grounds for humility. Anyway, I took them over. The first madrasa we went into was a Deobandi madrasa right outside of Karachi, known to be the chief supplier of fighters for Kashmir and Chechnya, and also to have spawned the 2 most violent anti-Shiite terrorist groups. That's another reason we call him an American hero. Not only is this is Azhar Hussein, he's our vice president for preventive diplomacy. Not only is he an American, but he's also a Shia, and he's over in parts of the country where they do very dastardly things to Shia, believe me. So it's required a lot of courage. Anyway, walk into this room, and there's it's filled with madrasa leaders and administrators and Islamic scholars, and it's full of rage. Rage over American foreign policy, rage over the what was then going on in Lebanon, when Israel and Hezbollah were having at it, and of course everything Israel does we get credited for. So there was a lot of rage. Well, I tried to break through the rage by saying, introducing us as we're not being a government organization, nor had we ever received any funding from our government. I said, and while the United States may have made some mistakes of late, it's important for you to remember when they intervened on behalf of Muslims in Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia. And I said, left untold, in most recitations of Somalia are the more than 100,000 Somali lives that were saved as a result of the humanitarian aspects of that intervention. And I said, and while you may fairly criticize the United States for operating with a double standard in the Middle East because of our strategic relationship with Israel, I said, so too can you accuse the Arab leaders who complain mightily of Israeli mistreatment, but then turn a deaf ear to Palestinian pleas for humanitarian assistance. So everywhere you look, there's double standards driven by perceived national self-interest. I said, but that's not why we're here today. We're here today to discuss religious values that we share in common. And then I quoted several passages from the Quran, a poor paraphrase of which is, O mankind, God could have made you one had he willed, but he didn't. He made you into separate nations and tribes that you may know one another, cooperate with one another, and compete with one another in good works. I said, well, I and my two colleagues are here to open the competition in good works. I said, the three of us happen to be followers of Jesus. And we know that you cannot be a good Muslim unless you believe some pretty wonderful things about Jesus. And so, that being the case, let's ask ourselves, if he was here today standing in our midst, how would he want us to behave toward one another? And by the time that conversation played out over the course of the next hour, that rage had really been converted to a genuine spirit of fellowship. It was remarkable. I'm not sure, maybe in the question and answer part, if you're interested, I can share with you the huge overlap in the theologies between Christianity and Islam, particularly surrounding the figure of Jesus. But then went up to a Wahhabi madrasa near Lahore. And this one had been identified in the media as the home of the London bombers, or the base, if you will. Went in there, same exercise, same result. And several times afterwards, the leader of that madrasa was a very large, widely revered and somewhat feared gentleman, has had several encounters with Ozzy, our project director, and each time he's made mention of the question that I asked, and he says, it has caused me to ask myself every day, what would the Prophet have me do? Now, that particular madrasa, which has not been involved in our workshops, they've asked us repeatedly to conduct workshops there, but we just haven't had the resources to do that and all else that we're doing. But they are conducting seminars in peacemaking and conflict resolution themselves. So you just never quite know what the seed is going to, what kind of fruit it's going to produce. Then, in another one, working with Deobandi madrasa leaders, after it was over, one of the madrasa leaders came up to me with his hand over his heart, smile in his eyes, smile on his face, and he says, you've made me so very, very happy. He says, we thought all Americans hated us. And I'm thinking, I tried to disabuse him of that, but I was thinking to myself, if you went by what the media has to say, that's probably a pretty fair assumption. Another madrasa leader came up and he talked about something that happened in his village where a young lady had been caught talking on her cell phone at 2 in the morning with a young man in another village in whom she had an interest. And the village elders had felt that this violated their sense of code of honor, so she was to die and the boy was to lose his nose and his ears. And this madrasa leader said, ordinarily I would not get involved in something like this because these things happen all the time. He says, but after our discussions on human rights in the workshops, I feel compelled to go back and challenge this on religious grounds. So he did, with some trepidation. This was not an elder statesman, this was a young madrasa leader. But he met with the elders and he pointed out how there was nothing in the Holy Quran that prohibited a woman from talking to a man, and he also appealed to the passages in there that urged the peaceful reconciliation of differences, and he pulled it off. Settled the problem, and no one was harmed. That is a situation where religion really trumped tribalism in a context where many Muslims can't really tell you where one ends and the other begins. So an awful lot of the bad rap that you hear these days accorded to the religion of Islam hasn't anything to do with Islam. It has to do with tribal customs. And it's not always a given that religion's going to trump, because as they will point out to you, our tribal customs date back 3,000 years, and Islam is only 1,400 years. So in our first all-Wahhabi workshop, excuse me, one of the participants, which was a surprise to us, was a Taliban commander of some renown. The makeup of our workshops is always a product of, this is what our indigenous partners do for us. They bring the people in. Well, our Wahhabi partner had brought this gent in, and he was, though he was somewhat famous, he was despondent. He'd lost 2 sons in the fighting, and he said, "We don't know what America wants. You come after us with guns, we have no recourse but to respond in kind." And this led to an invitation for me to come to the mountains to speak with the senior leadership about what America wants, which I did 2 months later. In the meantime, I did my due diligence at the State Department, Defense Department, to make sure whatever I said was consistent with U.S. policy. But I'm here to tell you that not only the Taliban are not the only ones who don't know what America wants, sadly. So anyway, I went up to the mountains in the Malakand Agency, which is, let me see if I can get this pointer. Okay. Right up in this area here, Malakand Agency of Pakistan, which is right across from, the border from the Afghan province of Nuristan, and met in the compound of a gentleman who was allegedly gave sanctuary to bin Laden right after 9/11. This is very serious business, and most of these were Afghan Taliban who came, but I was in this room with 57 Taliban commanders and some religious and tribal leaders as well. Started out by telling them that not a government organization. I said, and if the truth be known, my government would prefer this meeting not even take place. I wanted to keep their expectations in check, because the way I rationalized meeting with them was, I said I wanted to see if we could, based on our common religious values, come up with a confidence-building measure that could point toward peace. But I said, in order for us to do that, you have to understand the Western perspective on this conflict. And so I told them what America wants, which was to lay down their arms, distance themselves from al-Qaeda, and reconcile with the Karzai government. Then we went into a couple of hours of discussion, and there was a lot of venting along the way. There was certainly, by the looks on the faces, some of these people were less pleased to be there than others. But they asked about 5 significant questions in the course of that. First one was, what do the American people want? And I breathed a small sigh of relief, because I thought they're still cutting us some slack, even though we had re-elected the government that was causing them all their problems. And so what I said was the American people want peace in the region with democratically stable governments in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then they wanted to know why we were attacking Islam. And I assured them that we were not, and again made references to the past interventions on behalf of Muslims. Then they wanted to know why we were attacking Afghanistan. And I said, well, to put it in terms that you hold dear, hospitality, loyalty, and revenge, before we recognized certain members of al-Qaeda as a threat, we welcomed them into our country. We gave them hospitality, and then without warning, they struck. We wanted revenge, so we asked the Taliban government to turn over al-Qaeda's leadership so we could bring them to justice. They refused, so we attacked. I said, but we attacked with a heavy heart, because most Americans have great admiration and respect for the Afghan people, stemming from our common struggle against the former Soviet Union. And I said, it's also important for you to recognize the fact that some of your tribal leaders are now banding together against Al-Qaeda because they have violated your hospitality. Then they wanted to know why we were attacking Iraq. And I said, well, there's a bit of debate about that. I said, but as far as I was concerned, that too was a matter of revenge. Saddam Hussein had attempted to assassinate an American president. So I moved right on to the last question, which was last question was why we supported Israel. I never really answered that. I said we have a strategic relationship with Israel that isn't going to change anytime soon. I said, but what is changing is our understanding of compassion for and support of the Palestinian people. And I said, over time, that's going to make a difference. Then we broke for prayer, reconvened in a smaller group, and developed a confidence-building measure. And the confidence-building measure called for something that never actually happened. We gave it our best shot, but we weren't able to actually implement it, but was to try to set aside the western third of Nuristan, that province in Afghanistan right across the border, where there wasn't much conflict going on, but to make it a secure zone and then try to facilitate private development in there. Because what's happened now, you find that there were some commonalities amongst all these the Taliban. One, they hate the warlords. They have zero affection for or respect for Karzai because he failed to deliver on his promise to control the warlords. And they also think that the warlords co-opt the U.S. military at different times, and I suspect that's been right to some extent. The fact is that the development that has taken place, all the billions of dollars that have flowed in there, have just sort of been siphoned off by either the government or the warlords, and you find that out in the villages, not much has changed at all. And that was one thing these Taliban seemed genuinely to care about, was the plight of their people. So, we were able to get more USAID development effort up there. We couldn't get the private wouldn't go into something that is where security was as volatile as it is in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So one little point along the way that is somewhat humorous in respect, but it wasn't at the time, was the fact that at one point, one of these very tough-looking individuals stood up and he says, I can't talk to you unless you become a Muslim. And I said, no problem. I said, Muslim means submission to God. We all submit to God. We're all Muslims. No problem. So everybody laughed and we went on our way. Well, unbeknownst to me was the fact that my project director and our Wahhabi partner both got very concerned at that point, because the standard scenario is you convert or you die. Which just shows that the Lord does watch out for fools and incompetence, you know. So. But the one thing that did come out of that proved to be very significant was several months later, I received a call from the ambassador of Korea asking if we could do anything to help free the hostages, the Korean hostages. There were 21 at that point. 2 men, missionaries, had been killed, and they had 21 left, and the question was, could we work through religious circles to do anything? Well, we did. Yeah, called upon our Deobandi indigenous partner, who is, he's down in the area of Quetta, which is down in this part of Pakistan, and fairly close to Ghazni province over in Afghanistan, which is where the captives were being held. And I showed you his picture on there. He was the middle one of those 3. He had just undergone quite a problem himself in having been attacked by terrorists for working with us. They had pumped a number of bullets into the back seat of his car thinking he was there. It was dark, it was night, and he had been there up till a minute earlier, so they missed him. And ordinarily when something like that happens to you, you leave the country and let things cool down and then come back. Well, his wife was expecting, so he was hunkered down in the madrasa. He didn't feel he could leave her. So here we are 6 days later asking him if he can come out and take some action on this, and he did. And what he did was he formed an informal jirga of religious leaders, both some from Pakistan, some from Afghanistan, but all of whom were known to have some relationship or previous contact with the spokesman for the captors. Now, a jirga, if you're not familiar with that term, it's a term that's used in Afghanistan for a body of respected elders having decision-making authority. Instead of a parliament, they have a jirga, but there's jirgas at all kinds of levels. And this was what you call an informal jirga. So they went across the border, hooked up with the captors, sat down with them with open Qurans, okay, and sort of in the first hour asked them, when are you going to let the women go? So it was clearly so antithetical to their religious principles for them to be holding these women. Not an inconsequential question, because 18 of the remaining 21 hostages were women. So they stayed there for a week, and they said all they had to say in as many different ways as they knew how to say it, and then they left, primarily because they were all very ill from the local water. Interesting, even though you may not live far away, the water can be very different. So they left, but they extracted 3 concessions as they left. One was that no further harm would come to the captives while negotiations were underway. Secondly, that the captives would release 3 to 4 women as a sign of good intent. And thirdly, that they would engage with the Korean delegation that had been sent over, but had been spinning its wheels for about a month because there had been no engagement. Well, they met with the Koreans, and despite the fact that the Korean ambassador was the one who got us involved in the first place, we were unable to convey to the Korean delegation that was over there the fact that they were willing to release 3 to 4 women as a sign of good intent. Every time we called them, they hung up on us. They were on a very tight leash from Seoul, working with the foreign ministry. So what happened is that they asked that the captors release all the hostages who were sick. Well, only 2 were sick, so 2 women were released. And 1 or 2 others were left on the table, so to speak. But after 6 days, those negotiations broke down. And so at that point, we reconvened the nucleus of the original jirga, but through the networking that we had been able to engage in following that meeting with the Taliban commanders and all, we were able to get 3 former cabinet officials of the previous Taliban government who still had considerable influence, and they teamed up in concert with the nucleus of the original jirga, and this reconstituted jirga went in, spent a week, and then the hostages were released. Now, that's not the whole story by any means, because there was rumors afterwards that very huge ransom had been paid by the Korean government, rumors of $20 million. My best understanding, based on the intelligence sources we had, was that there, in fact, probably was a ransom paid, and it was slightly less than $1 million, about $40,000 a person. What was so interesting, though, is that there were captors who denied that, and it was very clear as we went along. There were several things became apparent. One was that the captors were not in control of the situation. They were responding to much higher authority. We thought at the time that it was probably Al-Qaeda, but then came to conclude it was more likely Pakistani intelligence. And one would say, well, why Pakistani intelligence? And the only reason I can think of is to take the spotlight off Pakistan for a while. But I don't, that's just speculation. I don't know that for certain. But it was very clear, too, that the captors themselves were not of one mind. There was one group that wanted to let them go on the basis of religious principles, another group that wanted to negotiate to get what they could for them, and another group that simply wanted to kill them all. So, but we were told, and from several sources on the captors' side, that had there not been the religious intervention, they said they would never have released the captives until they had achieved all their goals. And their goals, of course, was to free a lot of prisoners that were then held in Afghan prisons, which was never going to happen. So it seems as though it was probably a pretty smart move to try to go through religious channels. At least we felt that it was pretty effective. Two additional vignettes, and then I'll close and take your questions. About 4 months ago, we had a workshop for Taliban leaders in the Punjab, in a madrasa that was known to be a major al-Qaeda feeder. About 22% of its graduates made their way into al-Qaeda. But instead of going to Afghanistan to fight Americans, they were, because of their geographic location, they would go to Kashmir, be part of the militant movement there. During the course of the workshop, one of the participants raised his hand, and he says, "Does waging jihad in Kashmir sanctioned by Islam?" And our project director said, "No, it's not, but I'm not a religious leader." So he turned to our Wahhabi partner, who enjoys at least honorary mullah status. He, by the way, had been a former terrorist himself and had started a movement, so he's a rather feared individual. But he got up there and he said, "No." He said, "It's not permitted." He says, "Only to defend the faith, never to acquire territory." Well, this led to a great debate between the madrasa leaders and a consensus conclusion that the fighting in Kashmir was politically motivated, but not religiously sanctioned. And so then there was a kind of a buzz through the valley there about how could they tone down the militancy of their graduates. And 2 times ago, when I was my trip before last to Pakistan, I was very surprised to find that this scenario that had played out up in the Punjab was carried in the newspapers all the way down in Quetta in Balochistan. You know, Balochistan is considered the hot zone, along with Northwest Frontier Province of Pakistan. It borders Iran and Afghanistan. But all the way across the country, this had made news. You know, and so this is an example again of displacing the ideas behind the guns. More recently, just about a month ago, we had a workshop for 16 madrasas surrounding the Swat Valley, which you've heard a lot about. A lot of bad things are going down in the Swat Valley. Well, one of the participants, madrasa leaders, was a commander of the same terrorist group that brought you Mumbai. And he got up at the end of the workshop and he said, "I came here for the purpose of discrediting everything you had to say." And he said, "But now I feel rage." He says, I've read and taught the Holy Quran every day for 25 years. And he said, and this is the first time that I feel like I've ever felt the soul of the Quran. I've always jumped over those verses that really point toward peace. He says, I now recognize that the right way to spread Islam is through peace, not through conflict. He was outraged because he had been taught exactly what he had been teaching, and he felt like he'd been done a grave disservice in the process. So again, the ideas behind the guns. I mean, if you can look in the Holy Scriptures of just about any religion and you can find seeming justification for violence, or you can look hard and find it really overwhelming those kinds of passages. This is true in the Bible as well, It's really about peace. It's really what it's about. Anyway, let me just conclude by saying that just as setting a counterfire is often the best antidote for a blaze that's raging out of control, I maintain that probably the best antidote for religious extremism is religious reconciliation. In a context in which religious legitimacy trumps all, the best antidote for bad theology is good theology. But this business of trying to make religion part of the solution in these conflicts is not without its challenges. It's physically, psychologically, and emotionally draining. And it has risks. More than one spiritually motivated peacemaker has paid the ultimate price. I mean, you know so many of them yourself, from Gandhi to King to Rabin to, the list goes on. But I submit that despite the risks and whatever discomfort one may feel in navigating the relatively uncharted waters of spiritual engagement, I think the stakes are simply too high for us not to give it our best shot. So thank you for your time. I'll be happy to take questions.
Take those directly? I will, I mean.
Yeah, no, I'll take them directly. It'll be fine. Anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I remember reading some time back that Carter, when at the Camp David Accords, that he credited, or that he was credited somewhat for the resolution that came there, because he was a deeply religious man, and he spoke to the two others who were also deeply religious. And is that something that you know about? And has Carter, for instance, who is meeting your efforts with great support and help? And
well, those are.
How far? Who are you reaching? What's happening about that?
You mean in terms of where we get our support from?
Yes. Well, but beyond that, I mean, you're here obviously, but university support. I mean, what's happening?
Well, those are two separate questions, and the first one's the easiest. I had lunch one day with Jimmy Carter, one-on-one, to ask him about exactly what you asked me, and it was very interesting. This was when we were in the process of developing this first book quite a long time ago, and Carter wrote the foreword for this book, by the way. But I'm asking him the degree to which there was a spiritual dimension at Camp David. And he said, indeed, there was a very heavy spiritual dimension. I said, well, that's very interesting. I said, because one of your colleagues, who was your Assistant Secretary of State at the time for that region, who was staying up till 3 or 4 in the morning drafting the accords, is on the steering committee for our book. And he claims that there wasn't any. And so Carter says, and this individual's name is Hal Saunders, who's a wonderful person and a very able statesman. He said, well, Hal's a wonderful guy. He says, but he just simply wouldn't know because he wasn't at any of the 3 meetings at which this came up. And then he proceeded to tell me those 3 meetings, everyone who was present at those meetings, and it wasn't just 1 or 2, and names that I couldn't pronounce if my life depended on it. And I'm thinking to myself, no wonder it was difficult for him to be a good president. He had too much command of detail. But there clearly was, and the breakthrough came. Begin was about to flee the scene. Anwar Sadat was a very spiritual guy, and he was hanging in there, but Jimmy Carter signed pictures to the grandchildren of the other 2 and was giving it to them, and in the course of doing so, talking about how important it was to them for them to succeed here. And Begin decided to change his mind and stayed there and came up with the Accords. So your question is well taken, and yes, there was a spiritual dimension there, and it largely had to do with the fact that Jimmy Carter was a very spiritual individual. As for what we're doing, our support has, up until very recently, has been strictly from private foundations and individuals. Okay? It was to our advantage to not have U.S. government support, given the arenas that we were working in. However, at the end of the Bush administration, after Karen Hughes was stepped down from being Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, she was relieved by a gentleman by the name of Jim Glassman, who became Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. And unlike Karen, who had refused the mandate, he did accept President Bush's mandate to become the point man for the U.S. government in the War of Ideas. I think Karen had turned it down just because she didn't feel qualified to do that. Glassman did. He's a journalist, rather widely known, and an exceedingly capable fellow. Well, one day in one of his staff meetings, he was talking about the need to somehow a re-education program in the madrasas. Well, one of the interns in his office knew of our work, and so we were asked to come over and brief him, and I did, and he became a huge champion of ours. And I went, after I briefed him, I went over and briefed someone very high up the food chain at USAID, Agency for International Development. And then our U.S. ambassador in Pakistan. And then I came back, and 2 days later I get a call, and he said, we have $150,000 in year-end funding that we would like to put into your project. So it wasn't asked for, But it came, and it actually came at a very good time, because this was when we were starting this university effort. And that's what is paid for this pilot university program, is that government contribution. That is an area now, having broken the ice on it, I think we could continue to use government funds if they were forthcoming. But there's large areas of our work, like the penetration of the radical areas and the like, where we really need private funding. So if any of you or any of your friends or people you know are looking for this opportunity to make the transition from success to significance, we can help you out. Yes?
You mentioned that you've been having some similar attempts in Iran too. Would you mind if you tell us more about that?
About Iran?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. In 2003, I was privileged to be part of an Abrahamic delegation that went to Iran under the leadership of Cardinal Ted McCarrick, who was Archbishop of Washington, D.C. at the time. Abrahamic in the sense that we had Muslim, Christian, and Jewish representation on the delegation. There were 9 members. We went over there for about 9 days and went all over the place besides Tehran, we went to Shiraz, we went to Isfahan, Qum, Persepolis, and we met with grand ayatollahs, we met with the top political leaders and all. We did not meet with the supreme leader. But we came back, and then I held a meeting up on Capitol Hill, where I invited senators and congressmen to come hear about Iran, because people were pretty clueless as to what's really going on over there. This is back in 2004. And one of those who showed up, interestingly enough, and stayed, who lingered and talked to me extensively afterwards, happened to be Hillary Clinton, which I find very interesting that she's now secretary. And the draw was we had not only the Archbishop, but we had an Iranian Ayatollah there also to speak about Iran. This is an Ayatollah who teaches at Catholic University. A very good man, very respected in Iran. So the following year, in 2005, I raised the money to sponsor a reciprocal delegation to our country. Again, it was Abrahamic. It included the Jewish member of parliament, it included an archbishop. The rest were Muslims. And same 9 in number, same length of time, exact reciprocity. And one of the things they were, unlike, we went anywhere we wanted over there, but they were very careful to not go into any U.S. government building lest they be photographed, and it would cause them great grief back home. So at one point, this was one of the highlights for me, was I was able to sit down in a townhouse on Capitol Hill, very near the Capitol, but not a government building, set the 9 members of their delegation down right across the table from 8 very well-versed congressmen. And they were well-versed. I was very pleased that they knew their stuff as well as they did. And at one point, I remember one of the congressmen points to the Ayatollah and he says, "Tell me," he says, "do you think Israel has a right to exist?" And the Ayatollah, I think he looked like he was in his early 40s, but he was a guy who had a lot of poise and charisma. And he just leans back in his chair and he chuckles and he says, "Of course Israel has a right to exist, just as we have the right not to recognize it." You know, so and if in the whole, that was the level of repartee. And if I had to give a grade afterwards, I would probably have to give the highest grade to the Iranians, only because on our side we get stuck with our double standards. You know, I mean, during the course of that meeting, we're all over their case about treatment of religious minorities, when in fact they're the only country in that whole region that protects religious minorities in the Constitution. And moreover, just the year before, they had given $1 million to the Christian and Jewish communities to help repair their churches and synagogues, and the next year that was going up to $2 million, and it wasn't going to stay at that level. And when you look at the Jewish dimension of it, even though you hear all of the sort of very volatile rhetoric aimed at Israel, you find that the treatment of Jews in Iran itself is much better than you would think. There's 25,000 Jews in Iran, and that's far more than you'll find in any Arab state around. They've all been sort of forced to leave. And so we're coming down on their case, and frankly, the one group that they do mistreat terribly are the Baha'is, but the Baha'is are thought to be a heretical sect of Islam, so that's what's behind that. But then, you know, we turn a blind eye to Saudi Arabia, where it's 10,000 times worse. I mean, the Archbishop of Canterbury can't even get off the airplane in his vestments in Saudi Arabia. That's how, you know, so, but we don't criticize them because we need their oil and what have you. A bit of the same on nuclear weapons. We're all over their case, and we turn a blind eye to Israel. They come back at you on the nuclear question by making several points, one of which is that not only has Khamenei issued a fatwa against weapons of mass destruction, so did his predecessor, Khomeini. And this is a religious fatwa. Those are pretty sacred documents. They also point out how in the Iran-Iraq war, when Iraq was using chemical weapons against them, although they had the ability to do the same, they did not. And it was for this reason. So one's kind of hard-pressed. On the other side of the coin, you say, well, you must be covering something up because you hid these, you know, capabilities for 18 years that you're developing. Frankly, if I were an Iranian and I looked around the neighborhood and I saw that I'm surrounded by all these countries that have nuclear weapons and that the U.S. is bombing on the two sides of their border, I would want them myself for deterrence, if nothing else. I think where they probably want to get to is they want to have the capability and people to understand they have the capability to do it without actually developing them. Well, when I got back from, or when that delegation left, by the way, one of the people there was in the delegation was head of the Academy of Sciences, and I mentioned to him how impressed I was with this country, and I said, you know, it seemed to me like every Iranian was a poet at heart. And he looked at me and he said, from birth, you know. So, but it truly is an amazing culture and civilization over there. Legacy of the Persian Empire. It's just wonderful. Anyway, I'll get to you in just a second. I'm sorry to be so long-winded, but when that was over, I thought to myself, well, building relationships and trust is all well and good, but in light of the nuclear question, I don't think it's going to get us to where we need to be as quickly as we need to be there. So it caused me to ask myself, well, what else might one do to speed up the process? 2 years earlier, I had participated in a war game in which Iran was the target. And I asked myself, well, what would a peace game look like? I'd never heard of such a thing. So developed that idea, and rather than a scenario-driven exercise as a war game is, a peace game, as we developed, would be a exercise in facilitated brainstorming, where we would bring top religious, political, security, economic leaders from both sides together. None of them from government, but all of them too respected by their governments not to be paid attention to bring them together under the auspices of a world-class facilitator and try to see over the course of a week, how could we get past these obstacles that stand in the way of a cooperative relationship. There are about 6 very compelling reasons why we should have a cooperative relationship, and if we did, our ability to bring peace to the region would be just enormously enhanced. Well, I tried this out on the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations, a fellow by the name of Zarif. He was a former professor. He liked it. He was gotten very enthused about it because the world-class facilitator I was going to have was Roger Fisher from Harvard, who had written the book Getting to Yes, you know, the win-win strategy business. And I had gotten to know Roger when I was teaching up at Harvard, and he was willing to do it. And he had read, Zarif had read Fisher's Getting to Yes, and he was just intellectually curious how this could play out, you know. And I said, well, and to tell you the truth, I said, I'd prefer not to do it in a neutral location. I'd like to do this in Iran for 2 reasons. One is I think it would provide added incentive for the Americans to participate because it is such an interesting country to visit. But secondly, I thought it could convey a note of humility that was all too absent from U.S. foreign policy by us going to their turf to engage in this sort of an exercise. He told me, he says, if Rafsanjani, this is before their presidential elections last time, he says, if Rafsanjani wins, you can do it in Iran. He said, anybody else will probably have to be Europe. Well, when Ahmadinejad won, all bets were off. Nobody knew where they stood, least of all Zarif. So we froze the problem. But 2 years ago, when Ahmadinejad was back at the UN, I happened to be at a dinner with him. It was not a one-on-one by any stretch. There were about 70 people there, but I was given 5 minutes to present this idea, and he pledged his support for it. I didn't feel like I could get sufficient traction in the Bush administration to be able to make it work. So now I'm actually, this coming Monday, I'm going to be meeting with Lee Hamilton, who was former head of House Foreign Affairs Committee and who heads the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars and who is turned to by most people when it comes to Iran. And I'm going to share with him this and encourage, he's on our advisory council as well, and so I'm going to try to get this into the mainstream of the Obama administration thinking to see if there's a possibility of doing it. But that's where we've gotten. It's been a lot more planning than actual peacemaking or anything like that at this point. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering, given the sort of NGO quality of your organization, what role academics play in helping to formulate the concepts and ideas that you are putting into place? or whether those are sort of personally developed by you as the leader, or whether there are other people who are contributing to that process, like fellows or interns or others who might be working with you.
Well, it's a good question. A large part of it has derived specifically from what's to be found in here, and you know, this first book took 7 years to produce, and one of the reasons that it's in its 15th printing is during the course of those 7 years, the Berlin Wall came down, and ethnic conflict blossomed, and all of a sudden, what the book had to say became very appealing. And the enthusiasm was such that I eventually persuaded myself I should go walk the talk. So we're out there. The research that we do, I mean, before I did this, for 12 years I was #2 at the Center for Strategic International Studies. This is where, you know, all those guys with American sounding names like Kissinger and Brzezinski and Schlesinger hang their hats, you know. Quite I think a premier foreign relations think tank in the world, and I left the think tank to form a do tank, because when you go over and actively intervene, like if you're on the board of a think tank, you would get concerned about your fiduciary liabilities. Somebody going into a war zone, maybe they get killed in the process, they sue the center, what have you. So I decided that I needed to escape that and to start something where board members from day one know this is what we do, you know, and we try to, you know, ensure people within our limited means as best we can. As for always open to new ideas and inputs, we're very small. We haven't had fellows. We have had some intern folks. We had an opportunity. It was kind of very interesting. By the way, right now I'm working on a third book, and the third book is going to suggest how the United States can position itself to deal more effectively with the causal factors of religious extremism. Because if you look back to 9/11, just about 90% of what we've done has been symptoms, addressing symptoms, you know, and of course the hard power that goes with that. Secretary Gates from the fair state of Texas, you know, has come up with the conclusion that we really believe in. It's really the soft power that's going to carry the day in the long run. It's not the hard power. I can tell you, I've talked to one madrasa leader was talking about how a young man in the school where he was teaching, he and his family were violently opposed to Al-Qaeda and Taliban and all the rest of it until an American bomb landed on their home and half the family was killed. Not only did he go over, he took his whole class over, you know. So this thing about one bomb, you know, creates 10 new terrorists that's not far off the mark, you know, and it's very difficult. You're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't in this business. But anyway, at one point, the Luce Foundation, Henry Luce Foundation up in New York, asked if they could come visit me. So their chairman, their president, their vice president, and another board member came down, and we spent several hours wanting to know if they should get in the business of funding religion and foreign policy. And knowing well in advance that they were coming, I scanned all of my former interns and research assistants that we'd ever had and asked them, what would you like to see done at the college level? You know? So I had a lot of good input from the younger set. Gave them 11 recommendations and they implemented 10. And of course the one they didn't implement was funding projects like we do. You know, so. But they have, and very strategic, in fact they're funding this third book that I'm doing, but very strategically, they have given grants to University of Southern California, which has the largest IR population in the country, 800 students. They've given 400 to Harvard University. They've given, you know, to Syracuse University on the media side, and every one of these things you can see are being very, very strategic in how they're giving this money out. And they've given quite a lot to the Center for Strategic International Studies as well, on the, you know, to impact the policy community. And I'm somewhat redundant with that effort And there's yet another one, which I'm a part of, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has got a task force on religion and foreign policy. So I'm kind of wearing 3 hats, you know, because I was involved with the CSIS one as well. So that's starting a groundswell, you know, and I don't think it's going to be very long before we can continue being puzzled as to why we're not more effective at dealing with religious factors. And I'll tell you, there were two targets for this book. One was the Foreign Service Institute, where it quickly became required reading, but the real target was colleges, universities, and seminaries, out of a firm conviction, a very strong conviction on my part, that it's the next generation that can run with these ideas. You know, teaching old dogs like me new tricks is just too hard. I've got colleagues who still don't get it, you know, but it's there to be gotten, and I think we're long overdue in getting with it. So we go to, there's all kinds of seminars and presentations, particularly in the Washington area, and we always have a representative at every one of those who, I can't afford the time myself unless it's a really highfalutin one, but we always do memos for the record to find out what the latest thinking is, and then we can follow up with those folks. But we try to stay informed, but it's mostly operational research to support our work. Ma'am.
We want to give you time to sign some books.
Oh, okay. Well, can we do, let's do 3 more?
That's fine. That's fine. Okay. I'm not having a bad time at all.
Oh, okay. Yes, ma'am, you've had your
I've enjoyed a great deal, and I just returned from Iran, so I know what you mean by it. They're so open and so anxious to be understood. Very, very important. I was wondering also, you speak of sex, you've made contact with. Have you contacted any of the Sufi sects? I think they're spiritual. I think they're the most interesting.
We've had a lot.
India's wonderful.
Well,
and Uzbekistan. They're very good, wonderful Sufi philosophy.
Well, you find that everywhere. I mean, our first effort was in the north of Sudan, and there it's interesting, but yeah, it's all Sufi. And Sudan was not conquered by the sword. It was the example of the Sufi lifestyle and all that won it over from Christianity. But we've, in any number of areas, we've worked with the Sufi side of things. Sufism is, it's very spiritual. There's a sort of a mystical quality to it. And when someone is deemed to be a Sufi, oftentimes, like if it's in Egypt or somewhere, it's because others feel that that person is walking with God, you know, by the way he or she lives their life. They're very close to Bhakti in Hinduism, and probably the closest parallel in Christianity would be Protestantism, where it's a sort of the direct relationship with God. Yeah. But it's a good question. Yes, ma'am.
You were saying earlier that you were going to give us some examples of the similarities between Islam faith and Christianity.
Okay. Basically, in a nutshell, if you in the Quran, you will find, if you add up the explicit and implicit references to Jesus, they number, it's about 92, close to 100, far more than anybody else. There is a chapter in the Quran devoted to Mary. There's a passage in the Quran that makes reference to Jesus as the breath of God. He's deemed to be the only prophet without sin, the only prophet who has powers that only God himself had, no other prophet. They do not believe in the crucifixion and resurrection, but they do believe he's coming again in the end time to sit in judgment. Even Ahmadinejad's splinter group of Shiism, the 12th Imam, returns with Jesus. So it's a hugely important figure, you know. And I concluded long ago that Muslims don't have problems with Christ; they have problems with Christians. You know? So. Yes.
I'm curious, when you're talking about your work with Iranians, how much press coverage did you have, or did you try to avoid that? What was your position vis-a-vis the press?
Trying to avoid it. One of the things in our business is, I was just sharing this with Bill earlier today, we're in a constant state of tension between keeping a low profile to be able to do the work, but having sufficient high profile to attract the resources to be able to do the work. You know? And so we generally, as a rule, try to stay out of the media. We end up, if you went to our website, you would see quite a lot of media because folks catch on, they get onto it, and they write it up. I think the thing that's probably put us on the map more than anything was the fact that 2 years ago, I was interviewed on our center's work by NPR, Krista Tippett's Speaking of Faith business, and we were just flooded with emails after that. It was about an hour-long interview on our work. It was totally by surprise, too, because way back in the early days after this was published, she had me on to interview me about that book, and we had a great hour-and-a-half interview. It went very well, except they had a technical glitch. None of it got recorded. So, so we went our separate ways, but she said, I'll be back. So, well, after the Iraq study group came out with its report, she called me up and asked me if I could speak about that. And I said, sure. And of course, I didn't know any more about Iraq than the local janitor here, but I did a quick study and figured out some things that we might try that hadn't been tried yet. Went and sat down, and she says, you know, on second thought, why don't we talk about your center's work? And so, I said, great. And so we did that. It was so well received in terms of their playback that they rebroadcast it 1 year later, the exact same interview. And we got the same kind of feedback all over the land. So we're becoming a lot more known than we probably deserve to be. You know. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
First of all, I want to say that I really applaud your efforts. It sounds very impressive, especially for a small institute. I was wondering, and I know you can't solve all the world's problems, but have you been working on applying these methods to the Arab-Israeli conflict?
The Arab-Israeli? Well, I'll tell you very quickly, and so that you don't have a heart attack here, Bill. What we're doing in the Middle East, and it definitely gets to Arab-Israeli, we're doing some directly with them, but larger picture, what we're trying to do is we're bringing American evangelical leaders over to the Middle East to meet with Muslim clerics. We put them through something called the Faith-Based Reconciliation Seminar. This is one of the probably more formidable arrows in our quiver. These are seminars that go for about 3.5 days. And they cause people to have to go very deep about their own understandings and beliefs and perspectives and how those interact with others. We try deliberately to bring the transcendent aspects of their personal religious faith to bear on the situation at hand to overcome the secular obstacles to peace. And we deal with the wounds of history, we do all that sort of stuff. There's a very strong emphasis on forgiveness. And though we're not proselytizing, we don't hide the fact that what we're teaching them are the reconciling principles of Jesus. Well, I have seen this work. I have been amazed at how the whole concept of forgiveness resonates so well with Muslims. In the first meeting with our indigenous core group in Kashmir, these were 13 Muslim males. That was later expanded to all of the religions and females as well. But we're sitting around, this is their second meeting, and this is on the Indian side of the line of Kashmir, and you can see the look in their eyes. One of them had been the co-founder of the militant movement in Kashmir. Another had been the head of propaganda for it, but they were there out of their disillusionment with the dead-end effects of violence, and they saw faith-based reconciliation as a far preferable paradigm to either militant Islam or militant Hinduism. Two of these gents spoke up about how, you know, they'd gone through 2 of our seminars, and they said that they now had come to the point where they could forgive the perpetrators who'd caused deaths of members of their immediate family. One was, it was a son, and he had tears coming down his cheeks when he said it. And I'm thinking, it just blew me away. I thought, you know, when you think of Islam, forgiveness is not the first characteristic that leaps to mind. And I said, I wonder how many of us Christians who purport to be about forgiveness could internalize it the same way these gents had. I'm not even sure I can until I've gone through that same kind of a walk. But you know, the concept of forgiveness, when you hear that, it sounds very simple. It is anything but simple. And it's not about letting the other person off the hook so much. Justice can still be done. But it's freeing yourself up from the burden, the rage that consumes you, and then you pass on to your children and your children's children. And eventually it causes a neighbor in Bosnia to do despicable things to another neighbor for something that happened 600 years ago. You know, it's just nonsensical. And this is the only thing that can, I think, cut that cycle of revenge that we talk about. So we put the evangelicals together with the Muslim clerics, and we're trying to develop that. I've never seen one of these, by the way, end on anything but a note of reconciliation. There's often hugs, there's tears, there's all sorts of things. This touches hearts as well as minds. Once we get sufficient reconciliation there, then we're going to try to segue Jewish religious leaders in. And the hope is that once that all comes together, that we try to craft a religious framework for peace. This is the one thing that has been totally missing in all Middle East negotiations since God created Middle East negotiations. It's just, you know, people think that religion doesn't belong in there because of the absolutism that attends many of these religious leaders' pronouncements. But I submit there's three compelling reasons why you need them there. One is the moral stature that they bring. And this is terribly important. Just a very quick example. In Sudan, after it got its independence, it underwent a first civil war you probably haven't even heard about for 16 years. It was brokered, the peace was brokered by the All-African Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches. So when you ask Muslims who participated that long ago, why, you know, then as now, the Muslims had 90% of the power. And you say, why did you let two Christian organizations broker the peace? They say because of the moral stature that they brought. Second one is it equips you to deal with religious issues. For example, I have to believe that one of the reasons that Arafat could not respond to Ehud Barak when he was giving him what seemed like a sweetheart deal that even exceeded Barak's mandate. This is in the Clinton administration. Arafat didn't respond at all. And I think the reason is he's not empowered by Islam to speak on matters of great consequence to the faith, like the final disposition of Jerusalem. I think he felt that had he done so, he probably wouldn't have been alive much longer. But finally, I think trumping all of that is if you've got whatever political settlement emerges, if you want it to be lasting in nature, you better have the religious leaders feeling ownership in that process because of their unrivaled influence at the grassroots level. They can make you or they can break you. So that's kind of, that's what we're doing there. And I think I'm going to get the hook here. So.
Thank you so much. Let me say that I try to be conscious of people's needing to leave. I'm also comforted by the fact that we're going to dinner, so I'll get to talk some more with them. But I want to say a couple of things here that are relating to what you said. I don't know if you know about Krista Tippett's program, Speaking of Faith. It comes on, I don't know, Sunday morning or sometime, but you can, the best way to get it, I think, is to go to your computer. Go to Speaking of Faith, just look that up, and one of the things she does that a lot of the podcasts that are available don't do is that they're all there. They're all there forever, and you can pick them up at any time. You can listen to them on your computer. I actually commend to you that you get an iPod. I carry mine around, and it's amazing how much you can pick up from Fresh Air and This American Life and Krista Tippett and Diane Rehm and others, and that's the first time I heard Doug Johnston speak was on Krista Tippett's program, and I thought then we just really got to have him come here. And I think you'll agree, it was actually a very good idea. I think that, want to give there's also another reason for being a little interested in the time is we had a person here with a book that people wanted to buy, and the person who was selling it said, "My time's up," and took the books with him. I think we've spoken to them. I don't think that will happen tonight. But anyway, thank you all for coming, and I hope you will pay attention to the things we offer here. Often they're as good as tonight.
I'll mention one last thing here too. I meant to point this out. We just about a month ago came out with this monograph. It's called Madrasa Enhancement and Global Security, and it captures everything we've done over these 5 years, and it provides a model for faith-based engagement in other parts of the world. But it's really a dynamite document, so that too is available for.
It's here tonight?
Well, I can take.
If not, you can get it off your website, I'm sure.
Well, you can do that, or you can order it from me if you. You can also get on our newsletter list for free if you want. Just give me your card and let me know you want to do that. So.
Well,
anyway,
thank you, Dr.
thanks.
Johnston.
Great to be with you. Yeah, thank you, Bill.
Appreciate it. That was really good. Really excellent. Let me get you on out here so that if you...
Good to see you. Was your Abrahamic lunch and dinner here at the townhouse in D.C., at the C Street house?
It was.
I thought so.